it has gone to 7.2 trillion for the first time, which is compared to the 2020 years, it's more than double the figure.
But Anush, and not just expenditure, everything has doubled these days, haven't it?
Yes, exactly. So you can see the revenue also has doubled, and therefore that's why you need to look at these figures in GDP terms. So when you look at the figures in GDP terms, you can see that the expenditure is 21.8% and revenue is 15.1%, and the budget deficit as a result is 6.7%.
But Anushan, one thing that we need to note is that we are also in an IMF program, and what most of Anushan's targets fill in the realms of the IMF program, where the IMF expects a 15% revenue target and also a primary surplus target of 2.3%. We'll get into primary surplus a bit later. But when you talk about targets, I am reminded of the various fiscal rules we've had. So one thing would be interesting is, had we maintained the same budget balance last year, technically it would have been illegal, because last year we had a different fiscal rule that limits it at 5%.
Yes, exactly. That's the Fiscal Management Responsibility Act, which had a rule of the budget deficit should be less than 5% throughout. And since the enactment of the act, the government has never complied with that rule. But this year, the government has replaced it with a new act called Public Financial Management Act. And the government does not have to now adhere to the budget balance limit, but it only has to adhere to a primary expenditure limit of 13% and a primary surplus of 2.3%, which has to be maintained as mentioned in the Economic Transformation Bill.
Just to also give the viewers a little bit clarity on what the primary expenditure is. Primary expenditure is basically all of government revenue minus government expenditure, excluding interest cost. So you take all of government salaries, all of the transfer payments like Aswasuma, Samurudhi, and so on and so forth, and everything that the government spends compared with its revenue. The balance without interest payments is your primary balance, and the limit is now 13% of GDP. In that note, primary surplus is basically taking the government revenue minus the primary expenditure that I said earlier. So yeah, Anushan, how else has the budget moved so after that? Yeah.
So we can have a look at, that's the summary of the budget. So maybe now we can have a look at the revenue proposals and the revenue of the government in much more detail.
Sure. So like Anushan said, the government obviously aims for an IMF target of 15.1%. But the question now comes is how are we going to increase this revenue? And had you listened to the budget speech, there weren't a lot of revenue proposals unless you took your time to look at the annexures. And what our budget dashboard does is it summarizes it all for you. And I'm going to just wave off a few that I can see right here. One is obviously to increase or introduce the value-added tax on digital services. In addition to that, there is also removal of the SVAT. Simplified VAT has been a constant topic. It was in the IMF program to remove SVAT and replace it with the VAT refund scheme, and that's on the cards. Withholding tax is back on the cards, and it was announced previously, but it had come in some flack these days for how to charge interest or how to save senior citizens from it.
What exactly is the withholding tax change that has the government brought recently?
Withholding tax, Anushan, is basically a way of collecting personal income tax. And what it does is it basically withholds, or the banks basically, instead of giving you all of your interest income, hold 5% before. Now it's being increased to 10%.
And wasn't that one of your proposals that Verite research and you brought in for the government, proposing it to increase to 10%?
So we did have this idea back in 2022 where we recommended to increase the withholding tax from 5% to 10%. And now it has finally been brought in the budget. And one of the common criticisms you hear is, how are we going to protect senior citizens? You know, senior citizens live on interest income. How are we protecting them? The budget actually answers that by saying that not just senior citizens, all citizens who are able to prove that their income is less than the tax-free threshold, that is 150,000 a month, can be exempt from paying withholding tax. So that is a great turn of events in this in revenue that we see. In addition to that, I just want to maybe mention two more things. One is obviously the casino entrance levy, which used to be $100, then was reduced to $50. So basically, what happens is that all locals who enter casinos initially had to pay $100 when they enter a casino. That was reduced to 50, and now in the budget it is proposed to raise it back to 100. And the gross collection levy, that's the total, that's a tax on the sales or the revenue that the casinos make, is also proposed to increase to 8%. I'm just talking about the rate increases. There are also a wealth of digitization and a lot of administrative measures brought in the budget. Also, I would urge viewers to go and read the annexures in the budget, where it all not only talks about the proposals, but also gives you certain measures like ensuring that all VAT transactions are done at a point of sale, or mandating point of sale systems, or even sort of introducing databases of lands and so on and so forth, which is part of the IMF program. But shall we move on to expenditure before we come back again into revenue?
But before that, Raj, I also saw that the budget speech did not go into detail at all about the revenue proposals, but we saw the technical notes had a lot more detail, and it even specified lots of tax changes. So, for example, the government previously announced for personal income tax changes together with the WHT. And you saw that the government has actually given the tax brackets and the amounts this time in the technical notes. And what you can see from this is that the government has significantly reduced the personal income taxes of the citizens. So, for example, the threshold on the personal income taxes has been increased. So, threshold in the sense the tax exemption threshold.
Yes.
So, the income that you need to earn for you to pay taxes has increased from 100,000 to 150,000. And what you can also see is this 100,000 itself. We recently did an analysis and found out this 100,000 is the highest in South Asia. And also the rates that we had been charging up until 240,000 LKR per month is much lower. So if you compare to an average South Asian, the taxes that we pay in Sri Lanka is much lower. And the government has gone ahead and now reduced the personal income taxes further in this budget and previously. So that is something that also is a revenue reduction proposal, because you can see that the revenue would reduce as a result of that, and there is no rationale sometimes to understand why that change has happened.
Exactly, Anushan. So I think let me sort of, if you let me talk about like revenue, I will go on for hours. But let me summarize what the budget says on revenue. There are certain proposals that has been revenue increasing that is already announced, like cigarette taxes, withholding taxes that came in. Like Anushan highlighted, there are some proposals that reduce revenue, like the personal income tax rate increase, threshold increases. There is also removal of VAT on Ayurvedic products, on milk and yogurt. So there are a couple of proposals that come in, but all in all, revenue this year for 2025 relies heavily on how much vehicles come in. So vehicles or import of vehicles contribute to revenue in three ways: through VAT, through import duties and excise duties. And those are your three big increases in revenue. So guys, let's maybe, before we go into expenditure further, I want to leave you on that thought and maybe take a short break before we come back into expenditure.
Expenditure proposals of the budget, which was bulk of the budget, and let's see what are the main expenditure proposals the government has proposed. So the largest expenditure proposal this year in the budget has been the increase in the salary for the public sector employees. So government has allocated rupees 110 billion for this particular proposal.
That
This
is the
has been the
largest.
single most largest proposal, and you can see the second largest proposal is only 20 billion. And what you can see about this is that they've increased the salary from 24,250, the basic salaries of the public sector employees, to 40,000. This is, I mean, I would say it's a good move because the public sector employees did not have much of a salary hike or in the past few years, especially considering the cost of living. And
so even the budget, they do highlight that real wages have actually fallen, and that is one of the reasons why this increase comes
exactly.
in.
You see, the private sector, compared to the private sector, the public sector wages has not risen much. And but however, this is again adding up to the cost of the government. And you can see that the salaries and wages is the second biggest item in the budget after the interest payments. And this is also a concern because lots of tax-paying citizens has been asking why should we keep paying so much salaries, considering the fact that the public sector is hugely bloated. Because again, another recent research that we did showed that Sri Lanka has one of the highest public employment levels compared to the South and Southeast Asian nation. So currently, our public 15% of our employment is in public sector, which is very high for a nation like Sri Lanka, where most of the South Asian countries are less than 10% or even closer to 5%.
Talking about public sector employment, I think we recently, a few months ago, even did a fact check about the defense sector, where they claim or the defense sector claims half of 50% of Sri Lanka's salaries and wage bills, purely because Sri Lanka is in the top 10 countries of the largest military per capita. So we might not have the absolute size, but per capita, we are a small island nation. We are in the top 10 largest military sizes per capita as well, which adds to your point of the bloated public sector.
Yeah. So really the problem is not the value of the increase in the salary, but again, it is the sheer number of individuals. And the government even recently has proposed to increase this number, but there has been no proposal to reduce this number. Okay, going further, we can have a look at the next big proposal, the expenditure proposal, which is again a 20 billion allocation for Sri Lankan Airlines. And this is to pay back their legacy debt. So the Sri Lankan Airlines has been incurring a lot of debt in the past due to all the cumulative losses it has made. And even last year, the government paid back some of these debts. And this government also comes in and pays the additional remaining debts on the promise saying that the Sri Lankan Airlines would run by themselves without the support of the government. And we can also see there are several other proposals, very progressive proposals, especially on the social welfare sector, and on education, health, some good proposals. You can find all of these proposals in detail and in much simple manner by again visiting our dashboard at publicfinance.lk. So let's also look at the top expenditure numbers, not only the proposals, but as a overall, what are the expenditure items that's taking up a lot of the expenditure. So first, if we look at interest cost. So interest cost, as you can see from this graph, that it shows that this government for 2025 expects to pay 2,950 billion as interest payments. This is, you can see even the total revenue of the government is around 4 trillion.
Yes.
And you spend almost 3 trillion on interest payments, where 75% of our tax money is just being spent on interest payments, which is not being used anywhere else.
So the question that people ask is, where is my money going on my taxes? Turns out it's going for interest because Sri Lanka, and I think we have this on Public Finance where we say Sri Lanka is one of the highest interest to revenue ratios in the world. No other country spends 60-70% of its revenue on interest. I think the second country is, if my memory serves me right, would be Ghana, around 40%. So Sri Lanka, just imagine 60 and 44. That's the level we have to come in. Ghana is also not the greatest benchmarks. countries generally have it around 20% at normal levels. So that is a significant challenge for the country, and that also limits how much we can spend, because there is a limit on how much you can collect. And if everything goes for interest, what else do you have left?
And compared to this, we can see that interest payments as a percentage of GDP comes to around 9% of GDP. And we can see that the health and expenditure budget is normally around 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So imagine if we had not paid this interest payment, we could have funded 4 to 5 times of the health and education budget. And that would have been so much useful if not for the interest payments, which we have to pay because of the debt the government has incurred in the past.
Speaking about health and education, Public Finance recently said, Sri Lanka ranks in the third lowest in the world, or South Asia, in education spend in the world, in education spending. How does this budget address that? Does it change? What are the numbers on that, Anushan?
So if you look at the education expenditure, as in nominal terms, has slightly increased. But if you really look at it as a share of GDP compared to the last year, it has not increased much. And we can also say it's mostly similar with the health expenditure budget too, but education and health still remains very much underfunded. And this is one of the things that I was also expecting in this budget, because this government in its manifesto promises mentioned that it will gradually increase health budget to 3% of GDP and education budget to 6% of GDP. And as you can see from the sectoral graphs in our dashboard, compared to the last year, this year, yes, there has been increase, of course, but not as much that you have to increase to reach your 6% education target or 3% health target. So there really a lot needs to be done to do that. And the government we'll have to see how the government will be doing this further in the future, because again, it's understandable that the government has a IMF limit that it has to maintain. But in addition to this, the government also has a 13% primary expenditure limit that it has to maintain. So the government really cannot go beyond 13%. But the lack of funding on these sectors would actually be even like it would not really help the growth progress of the country, because the countries normally grow with investments on human capital.
So, guys, I think again, Anushan and I we can talk about the budget forever, but again, in the interest of time, maybe let me just sort of summarize what Anushan said and move on into some high-level numbers. In terms of expenditure, Anushan rightly highlighted that we are heavily constrained, one, through our own limits. We set our limit at 13% primary expenditure. Just to remind everybody, primary expenditure is all of government's expenditure except interest cost, and that's limited to 13%. And we are also, again, constrained because we are in an IMF program. We have to maintain a primary surplus. That is, our revenue minus the primary expenditure needs to be a positive number of 2.3%.
And this budget has
achieved that. And that's the last two graphs you see on the dashboard, where primary balance is actually 2.3%, or at least the budget hopes to be at 2.3%. Primary surplus by as agreed with the IMF, but budget balance, of course, is a negative. We are running a deficit of 6.8%. But the reason being, again, is something that Anushan highlighted, is your interest cost, and that is again the second constraint that the government has, which is also limiting expenditure, is how much we can spend on interest. Just to again touch upon that, the graph to your right on financing basically tells you how is this money financed, because after all, we have revenue minus expenditure is a deficit, which means that we are spending more than the revenue we have, so we need to find the money. The budget tells you that most of it is financed through domestic sources, so government borrowing internally,
which has been the case in the last few years anyway, because we have been cut out of the
financial markets. We've just restructured our debt, and we're out of debt restructuring, but we don't have market access like we used to in 2018-19, where we can go and issue bonds. So this time also we are financing it through domestic sources. In the interest of time, maybe we will go into macro outlooks and give our finishing remarks.
Yes, Raj. So what do you think about the overall macro outlook? What does this budget predict? For example, the GDP growth, because the revenue numbers that the government government estimates is mainly because of the GDP growth. And it has really not done a good job in the past, where the revenue has always been overestimated, and the government always had to get actual revenue much lower than the estimated revenue, and it has mostly been getting the macro fundamental numbers wrong, or rather, like in not being realistic with the numbers.
So this time's budget, all of these numbers are not in your budget documents. It's another document that comes with the budget. It's called the medium-term framework, where the expected growth for 2025 is roughly around 5%. Last year, after the crisis, we grew at 5.2%. We are expecting that growth momentum to continue. And we also expect the GDP deflator, which is another way of looking at price levels, to be at around 5%. So you would have heard the governor saying the price levels or inflation will settle at 5%, and that's what the budget aims at doing as well. So to conclude on the budget itself, the budget aims at meeting most of the targets set by its own laws and by the IMF program in itself. So we are meeting the 15% revenue target, we are meeting the 2.3% primary surplus target, and we're meeting the 13% primary expenditure target as well. And within this constraint, the budget also tries to bring in to spend a bit more on social spending, given that last year the IMF said that we failed to meet the social safety net targets, and controlling expenditure in certain areas, because the framework is set with all the targets we have.
And to conclude, I might also have to say this is just a snapshot of the budget, because the budget was just given to the public a few hours ago, right? Like by 2 o'clock, the budget speech finished, and this was a quick snapshot trying to show what the budget details. But we will be in publicfinance.lk, we will be posting further updates by looking at the budget in much more detail, and you can see more updates and more insights on this in our website. And in the meantime, we would also encourage our users to go and have a look at this amazing dashboard,
yes,
which is for the first time in Sri Lanka. We have put through budget numbers where you can have a look at all the past numbers and do the analysis by yourself. So yeah, until then,
thank you guys for tuning into Budget 2025 Live. I hope you find this dashboard quite useful. And please follow publicfinance.lk, where we will post more about the budget in the coming few days. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.